You're listening to Aanoodizewin, a podcast about the commercial determinants of Indigenous health. I am Bidasi Kwe Nimki Beneshi Dodem Wikwem Kong Donjaba Nogo Jawaning Doda. I am Dr. Amy Shawanda. I'm a provost postdoctoral fellow at the Wakabiness Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto.
My name is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto.
And in each episode, we sit down with experts to talk about a different health-harming industry and how it intertwines with the legacies of colonization and Indigenous health.
When you think about priorities for Indigenous peoples, what comes to mind? You might immediately think of improving mental health services or access to healthcare, maybe prioritizing recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or a focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, safe and clean drinking water. Few people would be likely to include tobacco on that list. But we want to suggest that that might be a mistake. Even if you don't think or hear about it too often, smoking remains a massive harm to Indigenous people's health. In fact, it remains the leading preventable risk factor of death among Indigenous people in Canada. More than opioid use, more than alcohol use. So exact data is difficult to come by, but it's estimated that smoking among Indigenous youth is 3 times higher than among their non-Indigenous peers. Overall rates in Indigenous communities have estimates between 35 to 60%, far exceeding the approximately 11% non-Indigenous population average. Yet it's not something you hear about very often.
Yeah, I think that's right, Daniel. It often feels like something we know we should better address as a society, but often aren't interested in tackling ourselves because it's just not that sexy of a topic. I personally don't know a lot of people that are deeply passionate about reducing smoking rates among Indigenous youth.
Well, full disclosure, tobacco is one of my main areas of research, and I do work part-time for Health Canada's Tobacco Control Directorate, so I'll just say out front here that all opinions on this podcast are my own and don't necessarily represent the government's positions. But I think some of what you're talking about, Amy, is something I've seen across the work I do in tobacco control, which is a response to tobacco control efforts along the lines of, well, is that really a priority? Does anybody even smoke anymore? And I think much of that comes from the uncomfortable reality that those with power tend to be those that don't smoke, and vice versa. There are exceptions, of course, but that's the trend we broadly see. So smoking may not seem like an issue if nobody around you smokes, but it still kills 45,000 Canadians every year, and those deaths, like so many other things, continue to fall on the most marginalized in our society, especially Indigenous people, but also to us LGBTQ+ folks and people living in poverty. So it's a priority whether we can see it or not.
Definitely.
Sorry to go on a rant.
No, I get it. It can be frustrating to see it go unacknowledged, especially when it's hurting our communities as much as it is. So in this podcast, we talk about tobacco with 2 experts on the topic, Andrew Waugh, an associate professor at the University of Otago and a principal investigator at the International Tobacco Control New Zealand project, and Perry McLeod-Shabogesic, an artist, elder, storyteller, and community liaison specialist. Tobacco is important to many First Nations communities on a number of levels, both as a health risk and for ceremonial purposes. On that note, let's make a clear distinction between traditional and commercial tobacco. A lot of First Nations communities have a long-standing spiritual and ceremonial relationship to tobacco, using it as a form of trade or as prayer. Tobacco, both in its form and the way it's used, is fundamentally different than current commercial tobacco. So we discuss both in this podcast, but we want to make sure that our listeners understood the difference and we acknowledge that traditional role of ceremonial tobacco.
Definitely. And the guests do a good job distinguishing throughout, I think. But it's also worth noting that this isn't the case for all Indigenous communities. As Andrew points out, there is no traditional relationship to tobacco for Maori communities in New Zealand and Australia. It was actually entirely brought over by settlers. So we also want to be careful, because it can be easy to homogenize Indigenous people's relationships to tobacco around the world, and it's just not the case.
So we cover a lot of ground in this podcast, including a creation story of tobacco, the tobacco wars, the trade-offs of Indigenous-led tobacco manufacturing, and the industry's continuous efforts to co-opt and exploit Indigenous communities.
Yep, and that last point is important. We are still seeing tobacco companies targeting Indigenous communities while using Indigenous imagery and symbols to sell their products.
It's a real problem, and it's just part of our conversation today. As always, miigwech for listening to us and enjoy the episode.
First of all, Anzo Kedijnikaz Shage Dodem, Bising Donjaba, and Anishinaabe and Dao. What I said was my Anishinaabe name is Anzoked, which is one who tells stories. I am from Nipsing, Bising First Nation in Ontario. And I am of the Klein clan. I'm also what's called a Shawanda, which is a helper, traditional helper in my community and within my nation. And so I'm here to share a little bit that I know about a sama. That's what we call tobacco, a sama, and its origins in our nation, and its use traditionally. And of course, we will have those conversations about how it has found its way into this colonized world and how it's been used and misused over time, and how our communities are now trying to take it back in a traditional way. I first want to say that according to our teachings, our stories, a sama, tobacco, was the very first medicine that was passed to us by Gajemnado, the creator. So it was the first gift that was given to us. And the gift, of course, was given to us to do work, to take care of this place. It was said that a long time ago there was, from the creation story, on the seventh day, it was when Anishinaabe or humans were lowered here from the stars. And it was 4 children that were lowered down, 4 sacred children of the 4 sacred colors of man, of the human race, I should say. And first child to be lowered down was that little yellow child. And Gajemnado brought that little yellow child to the earth, to our mother. And before he let that child go to find his place, he needed to give him his bundle, his very first bundle. His language, his teachings, his science, all those things he would need to become that yellow nation that we know of today, the East Asian people. This little child wanted to go and run and play, but Gajemnado kept him close in order to give him what he needed. After he was finished, he said, now go find your place on your mother. And away that little yellow child went. Next one was the little black child. Same thing, he brought him down. That little black child wanted to run and play, but again, Gajemnado kept him close. I need to give you your bundle, the things you will need to live a good life, that McLeod-Shabogesic. And so he gave that little black child his teachings, his medicine, his language, all those things that he would need. When he was finished, he said, okay, now you go, find your place on your mother. And away he went, like a bolt of lightning. Next child was that little white child. Again, he wanted to take off. He was so curious, wanted to explore everywhere, wanted to go and explore the deepest oceans, the highest mountains, wanted to go everywhere. But Gajemnado kept him close and said, I need to give you your bundle too. And he did. His medicine, his language, his ceremonies, all those things he would need. And so away he went when he was finished. Last one was that Indigenous child, that little red child. But he didn't want to leave Gajemnado. Gajemnado kept him close and gave him his bundle, his name, his colors, his clan, his medicine, his ceremonies, all those things he would need. When he was finished, he said to that little red child, okay, it's your turn. Now you must go and find your place. That little red child went out, came back. Gajemnado said, no, you need to go. He went out and back again. 4 times he went out and back. Finally, Gajemnado said, okay, tell you what I'm going to do. I need you to go, but I'm going to give you a special gift, a magic gift, and I'm going to give you a job, because little ones, they like it when you give them jobs and gifts. And he said, the job I'm going to give you is to take care of this place, to take care of your brothers and sisters, even when they don't want you to. And the gift, the magic gift I'm going to give you is this sama, this tobacco. And with this tobacco, when you need me, not want me, but need me, you put that tobacco out and I'll find my way to you. When you need something, not want it, but need it, you put that sama out and I will get it to you. And that is your job and that is the gift. And so today, in honor of that first gift that was passed to us to take care of this place, we use that sama in our ceremonies. It's always the first medicine. First thing we do, we're told to take care of that tobacco first, because that was the first thing that was given to us. And so we try to follow that in our teachings, in our ways, to do that, to use that asama in the best way we can, and in that good way. Miigwech.
Oh, that was so beautiful, Perry. I always love hearing the tobacco stories, and I've always heard so many different types of origin stories, and this one I have not heard yet. And what I really like about it, it really encompasses how we're all given gifts and how we use them on Earth and really living that Aanoodizewin, that balanced life here on Earth. Also, some of the teachings too that we also have is I think it was actually you, Perry, that taught me this in Shkwokemeke was it's 911. It's our first line of defense to
Yeah.
It's 911, our first thing we offer when we're trying to make that sacred connection to the spirit world, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Can I add, Perry, also that distinction between want and need that you made a few times, between not when you want, but when you need. Why, maybe building into that, what is that distinction? Why is there that distinction?
Well, because Sama is not there for your pleasure. Sama, and when you request these things, it's because they should happen, not because you want them to, because of personal needs or personal wants, I should say. And so it's important to distinguish. It's like ego and pride. They're two different things. Ego is very selfish. Pride is, carries that pride of who you are, how you carry yourself. And so again, it's that need and want. There's a difference between the two. And people could be using tobacco to win the lottery, and you don't need to win the lottery. You want to, so it's those things that you need. Sometimes as human beings we get that mixed up, but the creator doesn't. The creator will make sure you get what you need, not what you want. Yeah, and again, it comes back to that very first medicine that was gifted to us. All the rest of the other medicines and the gifts came to us after tobacco. So it was that one special medicine that we would use to offer our prayers in. It would carry, our requests, the things we're looking for, the things we're thankful for. When we have ceremony, whether we smoke it in a bogan, a pipe, or whether we offer it to a fire, or we put it out on the land, we're putting something in it. And so when you approach an elder, for instance, and you are looking for something from them, you need to let them know what's in the tobacco. What are you asking of them? You don't just pass them tobacco and then ask what you want. They're going to want to know what's in that tobacco. What are you asking me? Because maybe I can't fulfill that, or maybe I shouldn't. But once you accept that tobacco, because it's that special gift, magical gift from Creator, then once you accept it, you have to follow through with whatever is in it. So it's important, and that's why, when we use that to do our prayers, to offer our thanks to Gajamnado, to the Creator, that's that direct connection, and why we can't turn away from it if we already, if we accept it. And I think it's important to note that every nation, at least on Turtle Island that I'm familiar with, all of us had a tobacco of some kind. We didn't all have the same tobacco, a sama. Each of us had our own sort of combinations. For instance, in my community, the tobacco that we used in our area was called kinikinik, which is a mix of bearberry, mullein, red willow bark, red sumac leaves, thunderbird tobacco we call it, and a number of other medicines. So you would mix it, and kinikinik comes from the word kinikinaga, which means a mix. But that was what we used in our pipes, in our bogan sak, and in our ceremonies, and we would use that as offerings. We traded with a lot of nations, and that tobacco that we know of today, the commercial stuff, originated with from my understanding, with the southern tribes, in particular, the tobacco tribe from down south, and they would trade, and it became very popular amongst the nations to trade for that tobacco. But we all had our own. We all had our own medicine, our traditional asama that we used. We went by different names, but we all had that.
We hear a lot about commercial tobacco. We hear a lot about traditional tobacco. It's kind of this binary. There's not always the discussion of the evolution or what exactly happened. Can you speak to exactly how this shift occurred or how that evolved? I think sometimes when it gets talked about, it's like it just one day it switched. But obviously, this has evolved over time, and also they're not mutually exclusive. There's still ceremonial use and commercial use. Can you touch on that?
Kia ora, first of all, ngā mihi nui nui ki te tangata tuatahi o Canada. Ngā mihi nui ki te First Nations, ki a koe, Piri, ngā mihi nui ki a koe mō tō whakaaro e puta mai tēnei wā. Kia ora koutou. So I just acknowledge the First Nations of Canada and Turtle Island and you for being here today, Piri. I'm very honoured, and as well as Amy and Daniel. So kia ora, thank you for that. I think it's a very big question that you've asked in terms of this is kind of our stories of colonisation, and then as Indigenous people, we're diverse, and all our stories, are different, and our experiences are quite different, but there are some commonalities, and I think appropriation of our views, our replacement of our social institutions, and the exploitation of our cultures is kind of what I'd say is a common experience, and many of you will be familiar with. When I think Christopher Columbus first travelled to the Americas, and along with their cohort, they first came into contact with tobacco and brought it back to Europe, and didn't see it in the context that Perry saw, and saw it as very much a recreational product. And then if you wind the clock forward, and I'll talk about our experience in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it became widespread, and it wasn't used in a sacred context. It was out of its context of being in the Americas on Turtle Island, out of the ritual context, and very much a sort of, as Perry talked about it, product of recreation and a want, not a need. And we, as you'll be familiar, there was during this 17th and 18th and 1900s, and centuries, so I get hundreds and centuries mixed up. We saw a lot of Western expansion, and one of the people that was kind of an architect of that was Captain Cook. And so he travelled to the South Pacific to measure the path of Venus, and part of that he visited a lot of countries and places. And one of those places was Aotearoa, New Zealand, which Aotearoa was one of the original names for this place. And on first contact, he landed on the top of the South Island. And at the time, he brought with him, when he landed, the party came into contact with a Māori tribe who met him at the beach where he landed, and he was smoking a tobacco pipe at the time. And for our experience, so for Māori, we don't have any history or sacred use of tobacco or any psychoactive substances. So this was something that was quite alien to us. And at the time, the story goes that they thought, well, this person who we don't know who they are, they're obviously whites, they're not like us. One of the words for that's Pākehā, which is not normal. Māori means normal. He was smoking, and they thought, well, he's either human, and if we chuck a bucket of water on, if that pipe or the smoke will go out, or he's a god, and if we chuck the bucket of water on and it doesn't go out, we're in danger and we must kill him. And luckily for him, his tobacco pipe went out for him. So that's how it's our first contact experience. But post that, it very much became intertwined as an article of trade, in terms of being behind a lot of the trade for food. Appropriately, is suspected as behind a lot of our sort of inducements for land sales and things like that, which is common to many Indigenous peoples. And eventually became quite widespread. One of the things that was noted early on for Māori was that the rates of use were quite high amongst Māori women, and it was even noted over 150 years ago or so that these rates were high and they were having a detrimental effect on our health. This is before the Surgeon General in the US said that tobacco wasn't great for you. And so it became higher. Then we sort of wind forward to World War One, where we had the Māori Expeditionary Force, which was a Māori fighting group, and we had the advent of the cigarette manufacturing machine. So it became a wholly commercialized, exploited product that was, I think Perry's much more appropriate to talk about it, but it was nothing like what its context was, and became widely used and came back to after the war. And then World War II similarly got freely given out, and then we had very high rates of smoking. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our smoking rates for Māori and Indigenous peoples are at least twice as high, have been twice as high as the general population, which is a similar pattern to a lot of other peoples. So I think that's a story of exploitation, but that's also the story for us. And I think similar for many people is that's a story of colonization, is exploitation of our sacred ways and appropriation. And I think we still see that as an exploitation, that the tobacco industry operates in a way that's very similar to colonization. It's a new form of colonization. But also we have more complex things happening with the advent of, say, vaping devices and things like that, which is kind of another aberration of the sacred, a turning of the sacred tobacco plant into something that was never supposed to be. And there's an industry about that. But one of the challenges we find is that the discourse around health and research is about harm minimization, but that version of harm minimization is very much couched in a Western perspective of harm. So biomedical health, which is really important, but from an Indigenous perspective, addiction is harmful, the colonization story is harmful, and so we're trying to sort of push back on nicotine addiction as a harmful thing that was alien to us. And I suspect that and as I think Perry's been talking about, it's been the commercialization, exploitation is alien to most Indigenous peoples.
So I was just going to add to that any medicine, any natural medicine, is a medicine. It's the misuse of it where we fall short, or where we receive that imbalance in our lives, whether it's tobacco or marijuana or penicillin. There is an amount you are supposed to use for whatever your imbalance is. But if you're simply using it for pleasure, or overusing it, it's gonna affect your balance, your health. And so tobacco was the same. And naturally, when the original tobaccos were a lot less nicotine. Of course, there was no real additives. That was brought in afterwards through colonization, through the need to make money and get more people hooked on it. That was done separately. And so it's important to know that. And from our teachings in Anishinaabe, and this may vary from nation to nation on Turtle Island and elsewhere, whoever was using Sama, when I use my puagan and I have my Sama in my puagan, in my pipe, I don't inhale it. I take it in my mouth and then I blow it back out, because it's not for me. It's those prayers that are put in that Sama from other people, or why I'm doing that ceremony. So the inhaling of it is what began to change. People began to inhale it, and it became, an addictive thing. And so that was part of the slippery slope that began. And then of course the increase of the nicotine and all the other drugs that have been put in through the colonized process has affected even more. And of course that became what we see today, with cancer and all the other health issues that come with the overuse of tobacco, which is, again, it was never meant to be. An interesting thing, my sister-in-law, Andrea Bo McGraw, told my wife and I, is plants like tobacco or strawberries, those big ones you see that have been genetically modified, but tobacco is in the same place, is if you plant that, you take the seeds from that modified one and you plant it, and over 4 generations of that plant, it will revert back to its natural state. Now, I've never done it in practice, but that was part of our teaching. And if you leave that plant, you just live the way it's supposed to, it will go back to its original form. So we'll get those strawberries, the big ones, will go back after the 4th year to those small, tasty strawberries, the way they were meant to be. And tobacco would be the same thing. It would go back. You can get the little pods from the plant, from the tobacco plant. And if you seed that for 4 years, it will go back. There'll be less nicotine. It'll be more natural. And so that's something else. Creation will take it back. Once, colonization is not forever, and neither is the effects of it.
Building off Andrew and Perry, what you both highlighted here or really showcased it, that tobacco has become very political. It's been a very political way of use in the way it was traditionally used. And then in our communities, we have seen this, this historical traditional way of it was originally used to where it is now, this very commercialized product. And kind of building up on some of your research, Andrew, looking at the tobacco wars, that was a really dark place in our history here on Turtle Island, and looking at all of that. And then now even Perry, I know you're situated on your First Nations, and I've been there and to many First Nations that I'm sure you visited, that you have these tobacco monopolies that were happening on our reserves, and they were just competing smoke shops everywhere. A lot of people are like, oh, it's our traditional use. And I just jokingly heard, I was at a conference and people were talking about, oh, are you guys going to go smudge your lungs? And I just kind of chuckled because we're always making fun and trying to make light of the situation. But at the same time, that contributes to our health, right? So it's always in a way that we're making light of the situation, but also addressing yes, it is a sacred medicine, but also the nicotine is not great for us.
Yeah, and that's a pet peeve of mine when, my own people will come off and say, how that's all right, and they look at it as really a commodity rather than a medicine. And that's the effects of colonization. We picked up a lot of bad habits. We came from a society where the collective was more important uh, as the individual in a sense. We did things for the collective. The use of tobacco was for the collective. It wasn't an individual thing you inhaled and, for your own pleasure. It was something you used for the good of others and, the good of your community. And the same thing with, what you see now when you drive through our communities, and marijuana is going down the same route, where their individual, income and business is more important than the collective and the original teachings that come from, tobacco or the medicine. And so we're stuck in this, kind of a twilight zone of two worlds, of the colonized world and the traditional world, and it's sad, but that's the reality. But once colonization had taken its effect on our community, and I'm sure other Indigenous communities, you have that similar kind of thing happening, maybe different things like tobacco and whatever else is being sold, even alcohol. You know, that colonization has found its way, and when you lose your teachings, you fill it with something else. You automatically fill it, and so colonization offers so much, selfishness in that filling of that, and so we pick that up, and then we get stuck there, and so a lot of our communities are kind of stuck, and they don't want to let it go because they don't know, they've never been taught the traditional teachings. And so they don't want to let that go because they get pleasure or money or something out of the misuse of those things, that colonized way. So it is a struggle. But the good thing I see is within our children, our youth, they're not stupid. They're seeing a lot of this, and they're the ones who are bringing us back. They're the ones asking for their Anishinaabe names. They're asking for their clans. They're asking for their ceremony. They're the ones who are pulling their parents back, to pick up those things again. And when you pick up those things again, hypocrisy has no room. You have to start letting those things go. And the smoking of tobacco, even that is changing in our lodges. I remember going to ceremonial lodges not that long ago, where people would be in the lodge, and then in sweat lodge or teaching lodge to be doing a teaching, and then and even during they'd be smoking a cigarette. You don't see that much anymore because they realize that they should not be doing that. Now they're going outside, but some are actually letting it go too. They're quitting. They know they shouldn't be doing it, and so that realization is starting to come back. It's going to take some time, and there will always be those who don't, but you see the pendulum changing, switching, and it is, to me, from what I see, it's our youth who are doing a lot of that. They're the ones asking the questions and saying, hey, this isn't right. And so, adults are following suit most times.
I was reflecting on what you're saying, Perry, and I think you're so correct with we call our youth rangatahi, which is young people in our future and all that sort of thing. We've just gone through some big legislative changes around commercial tobacco use in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's often called the end game. So in theory, the legislation will mean that the commercial tobacco that's available in Aotearoa, New Zealand is virtually nicotine free, and it's very hard to get hold of. So in theory, that will mean that the smoked tobacco, commercial tobacco, will be a thing of the past. But there's been a huge debate around the role of alternative nicotine devices like vaping devices and so forth. And part of the issue that we've found is that the discourse has been dominated by this Western biomedical thing, saying, well, it's less harmful, it's great, let's get all the smokers onto vapes. But the issue there is that it's been dominated by Western biomedical, but also by adults. And so they're defining what the parameters are and what the success measures are. And the voices of young people have been missed in these conversations. So if you talk to young people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Māori, Pacific, non-Māori, non-Pacific, they're virtually all saying that smoking's not our future, but vaping is what we're facing now. And we've seen a huge explosion in vaping rates. And so they're seeing their health and well-being in much more broader sort of terms than just the health, and they're trying to resist the nicotine addiction. And we can see this is, I guess, the new sort of frontier for a lot of the industry of exploitation is switching people to vapes. And people say, well, it's less harmful. And it's like, yes, it's less harmful for smokers, but it's harmful for our young people. And it's not a natural product in any measure, the stuff that they're putting in commercial tobacco in vapes, for that matter.
Can I ask you, because I know you've written a bit about it, Andrew, there's been a lot from that industry trying to either co-opt Indigenous images or Indigenous groups, efforts to ostensibly or allegedly make this a pro-Indigenous movement, right? Sponsoring different conferences, etc. And I know you and others have spoken out against this. Can you talk about why you're not buying into this?
I think if you look at, many of the countries with colonial histories, Indigenous peoples like Canada, like the US, like Australia and New Zealand, the story is it's almost the same songbook, where I guess there's at least three levels of exploitation. The first starts with the exploitation of the sacred tobacco plant. And then as part of that is the exploitation of our culture and images. So you'll all be familiar with images of First Nations and Native American and Māori and other cultures, for that matter, being used to sell these products. And then the second bit of exploitation is when they reverse it back and start selling it back to us. And then we see these high rates. And I guess the third bit, which is what you're leading to, is, I guess, try and undermine our own sovereignty, we call it tēnā ranga tiratanga, in terms of infiltrating places where we can speak about these things. And there was a conference in Canada about 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was, where it was ostensibly to bring people together to discuss, vaping and all that sort of thing. And it turns out that and they invited a lot of First Nations leaders to that conference. It turns out the conference was sponsored by a vaping company that's owned by the tobacco industry. And so we saw that there, and then we saw a similar thing happen in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where one of the tobacco companies that owns a very big product called IQOS, with that, they're directly approaching Māori communities to promote their products and I guess entrench it in it. And we know from some of the industry documents that this is one of their strategies, is to try and recruit voices that are hard to ignore. And in many of these countries, Indigenous peoples have a voice and a movement to advocate, and we think this is one of their mechanisms. We know that, for instance, at least in higher income countries, that tobacco is probably seen as commercial tobacco is seen as a sunset industry. So they need to hinge and they need to get their products out before commercial nicotine addiction is phased out completely. So I completely think that Indigenous peoples have been exploited, and there's been quite a pushback in that respect.
And that voices that are hard to ignore piece, I think, is a direct quote from the internal documents. There was something published showing that they are building on this, growing awareness of colonization, growing awareness of Indigenous voices, and trying to, hey, we have the evidence. This isn't sort of, we're not just alleging, we can see it directly. They see this happening and are specifically trying to exploit that. And I know, so you made a distinction before, and Perry, I think you could probably touch on this as well, about this being a manifestation of colonization versus an actual modern form of colonization. So I think a lot of people see tobacco use among Indigenous communities as just a result of the traumas of colonization. But you've also written about the global promotion of commercial tobacco as a modern form of colonization. How do you distinguish those two?
I think it's a myth to think that colonization is a thing of the past. It continues today, and we're still dealing with, what happened in the past today, as well as new forms. And, one of those new forms is things like globalization, not to vilify it completely, but we have these corporate entities that operate as if they're sovereign nations trying to promote their will over other sovereign jurisdictions. And we see that being, poured out in the World Trade Organization and all that sort of thing. We also see how, like as I mentioned, how they attempt to infiltrate and legitimize themselves within not only, countries' political systems, but also within Indigenous groups as well. And I think, without getting too far into conspiracy theory space, we can see that trying to promote things like vaping as a, less harmful alternative to tobacco, which is, I think it's a really interesting debate that we need to have for smokers. But creating divisions in the sector helps the tobacco industry because it divides the sector on what we need to do, which is perfect for people trying to sell their products because it makes it easy to, one of the first rules of colonization is divide and conquer. And so they split up our power bases, and then it makes it harder to push back. One of the interesting things that happened in Aotearoa in New Zealand, I'm sure, and I know it's happening in other places, is there's been a pretty much a unified pushback on some of these practices, although the role of these new vaping products is still hotly debated. But what we do know is that vaping rates amongst Māori youth it's like 20% at the moment. That indicates the level of addiction we haven't seen since the early 2000s. So we must not think that colonisation is done and dusted. It stopped when, England stopped sending their ships to Aotearoa and all these other places. It's still alive and well, and we've got to recognise it for what it is.
Yeah, I can, add to conversation. This whole, scenario, it started from the beginnings of colonization. The colonization was like a fire that was lit amongst the Indigenous peoples. It just began to burn. Addictions become rampant for alcohol. Drugs were a little bit later on, but alcohol is a drug as well. But also, the misuse of tobacco, the taking away of traditional knowledge and practices, and then bringing in this, this selfish way of feeding yourself, but also because of the effects of colonization, the addictions became rampant in Indigenous communities. And then, colonization and corporations are like, we call them shapeshifters. They'll take whatever form they can to survive. And you see them changing over periods of time. Now that smoking is kind of on its way out, well, what else can we do to keep feeding the addiction? Well, we have this thing called vaping, and we make it cool, and we add flavors, and it just there's always going to be that manifestation into something else to try to survive. Corporations and and the greed that comes from that is not going to just die and lay down. There's going to be ways and means to continue to feed that fire, and you see it. And vaping's not the last. There'll be other sort of ways, I'm sure, that will come up after if we go through this phase and vaping becomes less of a thing. There'll be something else. There's always a vehicle for addictions. You just gotta find what's new. I mean, now our phones are giving us feeding those addictions. Our iPhones are online things are becoming that new addiction that's also feeding that. And there's so many different addictions that colonization is feeding. It's hard to keep track at times. But back to tobacco, back to smoking versus vaping, it's still misusing. For me, it's a pretty simple question. Are you using this medicine for your balance, to bring balance back in your life, or is it simply for pleasure? for recreational use. To me, then if it's recreational, if it's pleasure, you're misusing it. If it's for medicine, if it's for bringing balance, mental, emotional, spiritual, back to you, then you're using whatever medicine in that right way. Whatever medicine is, with guidance from someone who has those teachings or that knowledge on how to do that, whether it's a health professional or a spiritual advisor, you need to receive that. You don't just make up these things on your own that I need this because I think I do. It has to come from somewhere, somewhere, a place of knowledge and understanding, and so these new waves and these new ways of feeding your addiction, it just continues, and you see the changes happening, the shape shifting going on, and it will continue.
I love that description of corporations as shapeshifters. I've worked in this work for like 4 or 5 years, and no one's ever quite so accurately described the flexibility, adaptability of health harming industries quite as well as shapeshifters. That's terrific.
Andrew sparked my memory in talking about the marketing. I was going back to the paper that we wrote, Daniel, and some research that I'd done prior to meeting Daniel. And it was in my undergrad. I was learning about cigar store Indians and how they were the early forms of marketing since the early 1800s. And so they became iconic. And you see them like, this is where you can buy the cigars, and here's where you can buy cigarettes. And so they were impacting our communities, but they were also signifying to non-Indigenous people, like, this is where you can get cigarettes, here are the nicotine crate that you're craving. And so like, that was one of the things when you were talking about that marketing, and those cigar store Indians are still in our communities today. Like, we'll be driving through, the States, and you're driving through the reservations there, and you see them they're there. And I do see them occasionally in Canada, but not as much as prevalent in the States. But it's just so interesting that like they are still part of our communities in that way. And then just kind of building off of both Perry and Andrew, you guys both talked about that revitalization of traditional tobacco. Like, we're reclaiming it, we're bringing it back to that traditional way, because it's youth led. And they see, and I love this because I find this a lot in my research. I do strength-based research, and in there I find there's lots of intergenerational cycle breakers, and there's lots of intergenerational healing happening in our communities, which is so beautiful to see. But yeah, that's pretty much a comment, but I don't know if you guys want to build off anything that was mentioned.
Well, that was exactly what I wanted to build off as well, because I think we've talked about what we're considering individual use of tobacco, but there's also individual based approaches to tobacco addiction, to cigarette addiction. And I know there are plenty, that itself is its own kind of colonial form of treating addiction, as opposed to Indigenous understandings of addressing addiction. I'll put that out to you. I know both of you have probably thought about that a bit.
I think from our experience in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is we've got this pendulum of trying to address tobacco, and I think, and it's often the pendulum swings depending on the particular government that we've got in power at the time. And so if it's right, it goes right. If it's left, it goes left, sort of thing. Controlling tobacco, not commercial, because we don't have a distinction in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but I totally acknowledge that it's commercial. It's the commercial industry that's the issue here. But our tobacco control program started in the 80s, and then in the 90s, there was a growing recognition that there was high rates among Māori. We needed Māori-specific programs, and so we had these target programs come up. And then moving to the 2000s, we started thinking, well, we're encouraging a lot of people not to smoke and to quit, but we're not providing cessation support, and so we needed to provide the cessation support. But that was the context of smoke cessation support then, was that it was, if we're offering, if we're encouraging and creating support environments for people to quit, then we need to actually provide support for those that need it. It wasn't seen as a strategy to reduce prevalence. It was there to sort of as a support mechanism. But as we move forward, especially as like many countries have been over the last 20, 30 years, they've become, I guess, more neoliberal, and they've sort of moved to the more individual choice. And this idea that it's an individual choice to smoke or not, and then we can quit smoking. And so we need to provide and invest a lot in smoke cessation support. And, I think smoke cessation support is absolutely essential, but we know that these sorts of interventions, only have a modest effect at best on smoking prevalence. and B, they provide nice, neat numbers in terms of counting people who can quit, because it's hard if we do a more sort of public healthy type intervention to count the benefit. And I guess C, it's a convenient shifts the blame away from government responsibility and industry responsibility, which is perfectly where I'd argue the industry wants it to be placed. And so in the early 2000s, this was recognised because by this time, we had 20, 30 years of tobacco control interventions, and some of our leaders at the time, a person called Honi Harawira, who's a long-time advocate, as well as he was in Parliament in an Indigenous political party, said, well, this can't continue. We can't blame our people for smoking. We've got to address the cause. We've got to take on the tobacco industry. And so around that time, a movement, another person, Shane Bradbrock, and then following Tariana Turio, who was another political figure, started promoting this idea of tūpeka kore, which was a tobacco-free Aotearoa New Zealand. And so the pendulum sort of swung to not being about individualized victim blaming, to say we've got to address the source of the problem, we've got to address the supply in nature. And I think one of the gnarly things, or the tricky things we've been trying to challenge, it had challenged us in the past, as we knew that there were, if you provide a cessation service to everybody in the population, those people with more resources and more social support and finances are always going to do better. And that's where we get all these disparities ballooning. And so we knew to actually do something that made an equitable difference, we had to think about these upstream determinants, trying to think about how can we improve education and how can we improve general health and all those sorts of things, which were just such big issues for us at the time. But one of the things I think we got trapped into was thinking that, why don't we just stop smoking, commercial smoking use? It just wasn't in our frame of reference, because our frame of reference was all wrong. And so I remember when one of my, Shane Bradbrock, I mentioned earlier, said, oh, we've got to go tūpeka kore, this is the new thing. And I was like, my head couldn't get around the fact. It took, fully a year before I thought, all right, well, I've been indoctrinated into this system of thinking where we limited our possibilities. And then once we've taken that sort of glass lid off the case, suddenly our aspirations came big. And at the time, I still thought it was lofty, but then you get the right mix of people and then we can do something about it. Getting back to the theme of exploitation, the industry's obviously been very interested in what's happening here and have been doing things for and against. But like I say, I think, as Perry was saying, is we've got to watch out what their next moves are, because they're just not going to say, okay, sweet, we'll go and sell, biscuits or something like that. These are the shape-shifting industries. They're trying to legitimize themselves. They're going to come up with new stuff, and we've got to always be ahead of the game as much as possible with these things.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated, issue, especially in the Indigenous communities, because you have such in-depth poverty and social challenges and and addictions, and so the industries keep feeding that, and in a sense, if you can control the collective, you can control the individual, either way, in a negative way or a positive way. And it seems that it's not a matter of just quitting. It's easy to say that, but for people who are subject to different social challenges or health challenges, it's a more complicated thing than that. You can't just quit. You need to address some of those root issues on a case-by-case basis to help someone overcome some of these things. And I'm sure if smoking is one of them, there are probably a few others to try to help them figure out. So it's very deep and it's very complicated to get our communities to a good place. But I think that for us, that the ceremonial part, the understanding, the reteaching of our ways, of our understandings, of our medicines, is going to help. It's going to bring up more of a positive understanding and view. We're talking about what we call a two-eyed seeing, to see from that colonized perspective, but also see from the traditional perspective. And many of our own people, our Indigenous people, have lost that Indigenous view. We have a little bit of it, a glimpse now and then, but we don't have a good view. We've been so inundated with the colonized perspective. Our lives are controlled by it. And so we're starting to get that understanding on both sides. Once you get that understanding of both sides, that's part of the battle. It's not the whole thing, but at least you can see. And then you begin to realize, where do you want to be? Do you want to be on this side? Do you want to be on this side? Do you want to move your life into that more traditional understanding and living your life in a healthy way, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically? Or do you want to just stay in stay in that colonized world of of self infliction and and all the trauma that comes with it? And so it's a deep hole to come out of. But I think our youth are part of being able to pull us out of that. And I see a lot of good things happening with that. And my bet is on our youth, and I know it's still a long trek. Our youth are challenged with all kinds of things more than I was in my day, when it was just maybe marijuana and a little bit of bad acid. Now, you have drugs that'll kill you, in an instant. And so they are, the world is a lot more dangerous place in many ways than it was. But our youth are really innovative in their own, growth in a positive way. And so my bet is on them. But yeah, it's a big hill to climb. Who said life was going to be easy? Things happen for a reason, I'm told. And if life was easy, what would be the point? So these challenges, I think, just make us better when we're able to come and rise above them. And so those are my thoughts a little bit on this conversation. I may have veered a little bit, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
One piece I've thought about, one of the consequences of colonization is economic marginalization. And I was talking to a couple people about this podcast coming up, and they were saying this is an actual economic opportunity. Like tobacco is something that we're able to make money off of, whether it's the illicit trade or whatever it may be. This is a form of economic resources in the face of economic marginalization as a consequence of colonization. And you have to bear that in mind when you're talking about this stuff. And so I struggle with that. Like it's hurting the community, and it can actually be a real source of economic resources for the community. Do you think through this, both of you?
I think for us, we there's no locally grown tobacco. There used to be quite a few around the start of the 20th century, I think it was. So we think of economic marginalisation more in the sense of loss of income because of the cost of commercial tobacco in Aotearoa New Zealand. So our tobacco taxes, that the government stopped it a few years ago. There's a lot of debate about the regressive effects of tobacco tax, but our tobacco is some of the most expensive in the world. It's on par with Australia, I think. So there's that aspect. And the other aspect, of course, is that if you the people who smoke, it affects their health, and a lot of and shortens their lives by a lot. So there's economic loss in terms of obviously the earning power, but the social value and the economic and all those sorts of impacts. We tend to think about it in those aspects. So for us, there is no loss. The last tobacco factory was closed down here about 5-10 years ago, I think. So we do hear about there's these, we call them zombie arguments around illicit trade, and the other one's about individual choice, which is not so much an economic thing, but the tobacco industry often says, "Oh, you're just going to open an illicit market and it's all going to go crazy," and all that sort of thing. I know it's different in other jurisdictions, but we're surrounded by 3,000 kilometres of water here. You've got to be really, really committed to get the quantity of tobacco into the country that would actually make a difference in terms of being a source. And I suspect, if a country like Canada stopped commercial tobacco being available, you're talking like, probably quite a few, truckloads of tobacco sneaking past the border crossings every day just to supply. So it's the quantities required, not to say it wouldn't happen, but the quantities required are just mind-boggling, and it kind of comes across as a threat from the industry as well. And our research suggests that it's actually not such a big thing, but so from our perspective, it's a gain in terms of, we gain in cost. I know I'll let Perry talk about this, but one of the consequences of colonization is you lose economic resources and capital assets, and so First Nations and elsewhere need some sort of income, and part of this is beholden on the colonial government to what can they do to come to the party and support. I'll hand it over to you, Perry.
Yeah, it's a dilemma that I think all our communities are in to some degree. Some of the business people who are, in these industries, they don't seem to care. They don't have any qualms about selling tobacco, selling weed, or selling whatever. And but I think as a collective, and these are just individuals, but as a collective, as communities, it is something that we wrestle with, because we're most communities now are promoting a lot of cultural activities and things, and spiritual and teachings, and yet we're doing it on one side, but yet on the other we're challenged by going against those very teachings that we're promoting. And so, each community is, dealing with that in whatever way. Some of the people that are in these industries will use it in order to get out of it. They'll be able to work in. I know one fellow who had a smoke shack, and now he's moving away from the smoke shop. Shack, sorry, and he's developed a sort of a construction business and all these other things where he's moving towards. And he's doing this intentionally because he wanted to get away from that. Now, not everyone is doing that. Not every smoke shack is doing that. But, there is a realization, a guilting, maybe a collective guilting of communities. But it is, it's hard when you've been in poverty, and the only thing that can kind of lift you out oftentimes are, going against your very teachings, that, part of your, who you are as Indigenous, as, in our case, as Anishinaabe. So, it is, it's individual, but it's also collective, and we're always going to be faced with that back and forth challenge. So yeah, it was certainly, if it was an easy answer, we could we'd have have it all solved. But we continue to look through and face each challenge and each issue. But I think the constant thing I see in our communities is that spiritual growth, and I think as that gets stronger, this other part will get weaker. It may take another 100 years, but I see that happening. There's sort of a reawakening of sorts, and realizing just how hypocritical it is. Sometimes there's a sign that I just hate, going into one of our cities here in Sudbury, where it's a picture of an eagle feather being smoked like a cigarette, and it's lit. And I thought, wow, that's just so terrible. Yet the person who has that business thinks it's so great, graphically and everything. It's just, he was so proud of it. Yet he doesn't see it, what he's doing. But maybe one day he will, or maybe if it's not him, it'll be, his children or his children's children, But I have to have that hope that things are changing in a good way. But it comes with, to me, a big part of it is that resurgence of our cultural values and teachings and our spiritual ways, our ceremonies. That will sort of help guide us through this mess of colonization that we're in. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but I see it getting better, and I for one am going to continue to do my part to help move that along as little by little. And I'm hoping, my wife and I, we have our grandson, Shkureninj. He's just 2 years old. And I'm hoping one day I can pass my bundle to him, and that he will continue that growth, that struggle, those ways in a good way. And that's all we can do. Teach our children as best we can, and hope that they make the right decisions when they get older.
I've been just kind of listening, absorbing, thinking, reflecting on all of this great conversations that you both shared, and also reminders of the teachings. Something you had both talked about: corporations are profiting off of our people's addictions, through colonization. They brought this and introduced it to us, and yet they're happily making a dime off of every addiction, every person that they claim. And sometimes, like you said, Perry, our people buy into it. They want that economic gain so that they can live in a better means, I suppose. But again, it's profiting off of our people's addictions. And hopefully one day they see that, and it's individual yet a collective thing happening. Also, I was just thinking too of the shapeshifters teachings that was given. It's really so timely because I've been researching a lot of, it's daylight out, I can say it's Wendigos. And we talk about this as a form of colonization. Wendigos as colonization, a fuel, the fuel that keeps it eating and feeding and oppressing and marginalizing, and it's well fed. And that was something I was thinking about. And tobacco was forced to shapeshift into an addiction, and it is now turned into this Wendigo industry. And it's the monster we cannot see, but it's also our future. Our youth are the future, and our youth are the Wendigo slayers. And so as each generation comes up, they're reclaiming our traditional ways. They are reclaiming our ways of doing, and our youth are reclaiming our ways of being. Yeah. And so they will reclaim our traditional tobacco use. So I'm with you, Perry. I think it'll take time, but we will get there.
I really like that. That's, that teaching of the Wendigo. And I'm glad you brought that up, because part of those teachings, that endless appetite of that Wendigo just never ceases. And the stories of the Wendigo were like a premonition, and to always be aware of those Wendigos. And, I remember hearing that and never quite understand what that meant. But now when you see things in the way that are unfolding in society, the Wendigos are all around us, that just hungry beast that just is never satisfied and will constantly be around in some form, And so, yeah, that's a really good example, using one of our traditional stories. Awesome.
And applying it to today. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of research in this area, and I only do it during the day because I don't need that. Chimigo, Perry, and Andrew, it was such a delight to talk to you both, and your teachings and your stories, both from down in New Zealand and to here in Canada. It's such a rich conversation. I know I'm going to be walking away from here just absorbing everything that was said still.
Thank you very much. Really appreciated it.
This podcast is produced by Defining Moments Canada for the Bryce 100 Project, which commemorates Dr. Peter Bryce's 1922 pamphlet and his role in bringing to public attention the atrocious health conditions for Indigenous children in residential schools. In exploring the commercial determinants of health and their impacts for and on Indigenous peoples, we continue to bring public attention to the factors that impact Indigenous health.